In this lesson, we're going to have a look at Shakespeare's sonnets. Some of you might already know that Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, or at least 154 were published, and they were written about all aspects of love. So love is the primary focus of a sonnet, and a sonnet is a type of poem. It consists of 14 lines, and those 14 lines are made up of two sections. There's an octet, which, if you think about octagon, an octet is 8 of the lines, and then a sestet, which is 6 of the lines. So it's 8 and 6, 14 lines in total. Now those two groupings, the octet and the sestet, are separated by what's called a volta, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in a sonnet, you would be able to identify a sonnet by the number of lines, the presence of an octet, 8 lines, the presence of a sestet of 6 lines, and a volta. Another way to identify a sonnet is they will usually be written in iambic pentameter. So Shakespeare, as we started to identify last week, continued in the tradition begun by writers such as Geoffrey Chaucer by writing in iambic pentameter. So let's explore the volta. So the volta is the moment in the poem whereby the poet suddenly changes their point of view or their train of thought. So this picture depicts Janus, who is traditionally represented as having two faces because he looks both ways, Janus does, into the past and into the future. So I've used that picture to identify how you might look for the volta in a sonnet. It's the moment at which somebody seems to have been looking one way and expressing one opinion, but then suddenly they change and they look at it from a different angle, or they change their opinion. Sometimes they might undermine what they've said before. So they've delivered a certain argument for the octet, and then just before the sestet, they change their mind and offer a different perspective. So the volta is the change in the train of thought of the poet. It's the change in the train of thought, and it usually happens between the octet and the sestet. It usually happens after 8 lines, and they suddenly change their point of view or their train of thought. So that's what we need to look out for in sonnets that we're going to study by Shakespeare. Before we begin looking at our first sonnet, we just need to clear up a couple of bits of vocabulary, and they all centre around the pronoun you. In our generation, in modern English, we use the word you in various places, but it always takes the same form, whereas in Shakespearean language, if we're looking at the Elizabethan period, there were various ways of saying you. So these are some of the examples, some of the different versions of you that you might see in sonnets. The first one is thou. So thou still means you, but it's used usually before a verb. So it means you, and then you might say you are, you will, or you have. So the key thing there is thou means you, and then the word that follows it will be a verb, and usually the verb ending will be t, st, or est. So you might see phrases such as thou art, which means you are, thou hast, which means you have, and thou runnest, which means you run. So that's one version to look out for. There is also the version of you which is pronounced thee. So thee means you as well, but this time this is the objective use. This is used normally at the end of a sentence. It's normally after some sort of declaration. So I love you would be I love thee. Thy is your, so pick up thy sword. Thy is your. Thine is another version of your, and that's usually used if the verb that they have begins with a vowel. So if it needs to have an N sound to make it make sense to listen to. So you might say thine ears. So lend me thine ears. Rather than thy ears, it sounds better to say thine. And then finally, thyself is yourself. So if you see any of these 5 words in Shakespeare, they are all versions of you or your. So here's the first sonnet we're going to look at, and it's a very famous sonnet. It's sonnet number 18. On the left-hand side in the darker text, you can see Shakespeare's words, and on the right-hand side in the light grey, you can see a modern translation, just to help you out. So I'm going to read Shakespeare's version on the left. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. We're going to answer the following questions. In your books on paper, you can write your answers and then share them with your teacher. So the first question we're going to answer is, what problems does Shakespeare identify about summer? Second question is, what does Shakespeare say will happen to all beautiful things? And the third question is, why won't this happen to the person he's writing about? So what problems does he identify about summer? What does he say will happen to all beautiful things? And why won't this happen to the person he's writing about? Here are the opening few lines, and these lines are where we can find the problems that Shakespeare identifies about summer. So in the first line, he asks a rhetorical question. He asks, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Now at this point, he's asking himself, what can I compare you to, this person that he is in love with? What can I compare you to? Well, should I compare you to a summer's day? So the association with summer would be positive, it would be warm, it would be pretty, it would be a long day. But then what he says is this, thou, you, art more lovely. So you are more lovely and more temperate. Now that word temperate means constant. So if you think about a summer's day, especially in Britain, yes, they can be lovely and sunny and warm, but that's not a given. And in the summer, we never know really in this country whether we're going to get sun or not. So what he's saying there is, well, shall I compare you to a summer's day? I could, but you're more lovely and more constant. So if I had a summer's day or you, I would choose you first because you're more lovely and you're more consistent. Then he says, secondly, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. So also in the summer, it gets windy. It gets quite violent in terms of the blossom is blown from the trees and all the buds are knocked about by the wind. So again, if he's comparing the love of his life to a summer's day, the love of his life comes off a little bit better. Then he says, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. So hath means has. He's basically saying there that summer is quite short. And again, in Britain, if we think about it, he's not wrong. Summer doesn't last very long. Sometimes we get a couple of weeks of warm weather and the rest of the time it's kind of standard British mediocre weather. So those first 3 ideas identify the problems. Summer is inconstant, it's inconsistent, it gets windy, it's short. Now your job is to identify the final 2 problems that Shakespeare thinks about summer. So in the last 2 lines, he says, sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. So you need to think about what the eye of heaven might be and what he's saying about it. And then, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. So what is he saying also happens? So there are 2 more problems there about summer. So your job is to write up on a bit of paper what the problems are with summer that Shakespeare identifies. And we've talked about 3 together in yellow. And then the last 2 lines are 2 more that you can write up on your own. Here are the last 2 lines in the octet. Shakespeare says, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. What is Shakespeare saying will happen to all beautiful things? So every fair from fair, every beautiful thing from a beautiful thing sometime declines. What do you think that means? And why does it happen? By chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. What does Shakespeare say will happen to all beautiful things? And there's a clue in the picture there. So again, write down your answer underneath your previous work. What does Shakespeare say will happen to all beautiful things? The final question that we have to answer is, why won't this happen to the person he is writing about? So in the previous couple of lines, we found out what Shakespeare thinks will happen to all beautiful things. Now, according to Shakespeare, that won't happen to the person he's writing about. Now, out of interest, scholars over the years have come to the conclusion that Shakespeare was speaking to, at this point, a young man, and approximately 126 of his sonnets were said to be aimed towards this man. So the man that Shakespeare is writing to, Shakespeare seems to want him to know that his beauty, his metaphorical summer will not end in the same way as everything else in nature. And the reason he gives is this. He says, but thy, remember that means your, but thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. What is Shakespeare saying to this person? What is this that gives life to him? Why won't this person fade? Why won't this person ever really die? What will happen to them? Where will they remain? What is Shakespeare telling this person about how he will become immortal, in a sense? So the answers are in these lines. Don't forget to look back at the translation if you need to. And this moment, you should be able to identify this as being the volta. So remember we said to look out for the word but or yet or and yet. Well, this sestet, the last 6 lines, begin with the volta, which is when Shakespeare identifies that no matter what he's just said about whether or not this person is better or worse than summer, he's compared him to summer, but now he's saying, but actually, after all of that, it doesn't really matter, because your eternal summer shall not fade, and here's the reason why. So, underneath the work you've done so far, I'd like you to try and explain in your own words why this person why their beauty will not fade, why they will, to a degree, live forever. What does Shakespeare say about what will happen to them and why they will carry on much longer than summer? So today we have learnt what a sonnet is. It is a poem. Shakespeare wrote 154 of them. 126 of those were said to be directed towards a young man. Sonnets tend to be centred around the emotion of love. They are recognisable by the fact that they have 14 lines. Those 14 lines are broken up into an 8 and a 6, so an octet and a sestet, and there is usually a volta at the beginning of the sestet, which demonstrates or reveals a change in thought of the writer. Next lesson, we're going to have a look at writing our own. Well done.